Okay. Why don't you go to the first slide, Mary? Okay. Um, as Miriam said, I have an adult son with schizoaffective disorder. He got sick when he was 19, and he's 42 now. And so I have a long history with this. And about 6 years ago, my wife and I started thinking about, well, what's going to happen after we die? And
Oh, Jack, sorry, you were muted on
Yeah.
accident.
Check the chat and say
Oh, Jack, you're muted.
okay,
Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
okay, can people hear me now?
Mm-hmm. You
All
were
right.
talking about schizoaffective disorder.
Yeah, okay. Um, anyway, about 6 or 7 years ago, my wife and I decided we ought to have some kind of idea of what's going to happen to our assets and who's going to take care of our son after we're gone. Um, so I did some investigation about that, and we had our own estate plan, just my wife and I. And we heard about special needs trusts. And so we did some research, and we uh, we realized that we had to do it right away. We had to set up a special needs trust for him right away. And the reason that we needed to is he is on SSI, so he gets government benefits, which is a big question that you have to ask yourself if you want to set up something for your loved one. Is do they receive government benefits, in particular SSI, now, or will they be receiving SSI after you're gone? Of course, you don't know that, but you're trying to manage from the grave, which is tricky. Um, so, do you expect your loved one to be receiving SSI or SSDI, which is completely different? SSDI is disability insurance run by Social Security, or some other benefit. Um, SSI has an asset limit of $2,000, which hasn't been changed in decades since it was set up. And the one of the purposes of a special needs trust is to have someone deal with that asset limit, which is quite low, and $2,000. At the end of each month, Social Security looks at your beneficiary, that means your loved one's assets, adds them all up, and some are excluded, some are included, but he or she can't have more than $2,000 in assets, or else they'll get kicked off of SSI, and you don't want that to happen. Um, and I'll explain, there's some exclusions for what those assets are, and I'll explain that later. And then the question you want to ask yourself is, how much money will your beneficiary, your loved one, inherit? Um, in my case, we have a daughter, like I said, who's quite healthy, and our main trust, uh, my wife and I divide our assets in half. So my son will inherit half of our assets, and my daughter will inherit the other half. But of course, we didn't want to have my son's assets go directly to him. That was out of the question. Um, so and he is on SSI, and I imagine he'll stay on SSI for the rest of his life, and maybe. And another question we had to ask is, do we need a lawyer to set up a special needs trust? And we already had a lawyer that set up our family trust, my wife and I. And we asked her about that, and she said, no, you really should have a specialized special needs trust lawyer to write, to set up the special needs trust. So we went about looking for a lawyer, and that wasn't too hard to find a lawyer who specialized in special needs trusts. Now, do you have experience with special needs trusts? And this lawyer did. She was actually the daughter of a lawyer who wrote the first special needs trust. And so she knew what she was doing. All right. The next question to ask yourself is, what kind of trust do I want? If your loved one, I'll call your loved one the beneficiary, has been ill, was ill before he or she was 26 years old, then you're eligible. Oh no, I'm mixing things up. Is your loved one on government benefits, or will they be? Then you need a special needs trust to protect your loved one from himself or herself. And can they or the trustee of the trust handle the asset limit, which is really, I told you, $2,000 a month. At the end of the month, Social Security checks his bank accounts and stuff, like I said. And are they able to handle that? The asset limit can be overcome with something called an ABLE account. ABLE stands for Achieving a Better Life Experience. And at the end of the presentation, there's a website for the California ABLE account, and you can educate yourself on that. But that's a way to get over that $2,000 limit, which is, and you want to help your beneficiary with car repairs or to buy a car to begin with. And, of course, $2,000 isn't enough for that. So you probably want to establish an ABLE account. And that's what I was confused about. I'll talk about ABLE accounts later. But in order to qualify for an ABLE account, you have to show that your loved one was disabled before the age of 26. But there's a way around that too, which I'll talk about. If your loved one is not on government benefits, you might want to consider something called a spendthrift trust. A spendthrift trust is simply a trust for your loved one where somebody else manages the money. If you think that your beneficiary can't handle money and will blow all the money or will have a windfall and all the money will disappear, then you can establish a spendthrift trust so that somebody, the trustee of the trust, doles out the money to your loved one. So that's something to consider. It's called a spendthrift trust to prevent your loved one from blowing all the inheritance. Or you might not need a trust at all. Excuse me, you might not need a trust at all. If your loved one, if you trust that person to manage their own money, then you don't really need a special kind of trust. You can just trust that they'll handle the money directly. Now, I'm going to spend most of my time in this presentation talking about special needs trusts, because I'm going to assume that that's probably what most of you need, which is a big assumption, but I'm going to make that assumption. A special needs trust is all about the trustee, which can also be a fiduciary. A fiduciary is a legal term that says that they're going to have your best interests in mind, basically, legally. Now, choosing a trustee is what this is all about. I've heard several presentations by lawyers at NAMI, and they all say the same thing. Choosing the trustee is the most important part of the process. Because what are the duties of the trustee? They not only manage the money, but they manage the care of the person. They manage the taxes. They manage the SSI reporting. They do an awful lot of stuff. They're basically replacing you as much as possible. maybe not them directly, but they manage that. They can hire a caseworker if necessary. So finding a trustee is really the challenge of this whole thing. It took my wife and I 2 years of interviewing potential trustees to find one that we both agreed on. We don't agree on much, so it was challenging to find one that we both agreed on. But when we found one that we both liked, we knew it instantly. But it takes effort. Most of them will have interviews for free. Maybe they'll charge you, but you go to the interview, you talk to them for 45 minutes or an hour sometimes, and you ask them questions. And later in the presentation, I'll have a list of questions that you want to use to ask the trustee, to find a trustee that will work for you. Again, what they do is they deal with government benefits, handling emergencies, everything, really. Who will be the trustee? Well, a lot of people naively think, and we were in this category, well, we'll appoint our daughter as the trustee, because after all, she knows our son, she has his best interests at heart. But that several people, including several lawyers, told us that yes, you can appoint a relative and a sibling as a trustee. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. However, most of them said, and they said it very frankly, they said, it's usually a bad idea. Because then you've got your loved one who has a mental illness, money being doled out to him by his relative. And it's not that that can't work. It can, depending on the relative, depending on the people involved. But it's fraught with difficulty. You know, the loved one, if he or she has a mental illness to begin with, maybe is paranoid, maybe is, they have some major deficit usually. And having in our case, his sister dole out money, we knew that wasn't going to work. It just was a bad idea. It was our initial idea to have her as the trustee, but it was a bad idea. And then some people say, well, I'll have a bank do it, because surely the bank is, they can function as a fiduciary trustee. And we were warned against that too, because a bank doesn't really have your loved one's interest at heart. Their interest is making money, usually. And the trustee will usually, unless they're a relative, and even if they are a relative, take a fee for doing their job. And the banks have a reputation for exhausting the principle of the trust with fees. So you end up with your loved one having nothing. That isn't always going to happen. It depends on the bank. It depends on the person in the bank doing this job, but it can happen. So we were strongly advised against appointing a bank as the trustee. Then there's something called a pooled trust organization. And in California, it's called what's it called? Hold on. Got the name of it. Hold on. The Proxy Parent Foundation. And I'll have this all written down for you at the end of the presentation. And they pool money that is inherited by their beneficiaries, and they appoint from within their own organization a trustee, and they handle everything. And we didn't use them, so I can't vouch for their reputation. But one of the lawyers that gave a presentation is on their board of directors. His name is Baron Miller, and I'll give you his information at the end of the presentation. And he's a trustee of this organization, and he thinks very highly of them. He's a family member, so he knows what he's doing. And often it's used by families. A lot of the private trustees have a minimum principal that they'll deal with. For us, it was $1 million. And now it's probably double that. And, you know, when you combine any real estate you own or something like that, it gets pretty big pretty fast. And if you don't meet the minimum principal of the trustee that you're interested in, then you can the proxy parent foundation has a very low minimum. So if you have an estate worth, I don't know, $200,000 or maybe even less, you can look at their website and find out what their minimum is, if there is. I think they do have a minimum, but I'm not sure. The other place where you can find a trustee is a private person. And that's what we did. We interviewed 12 private fiduciary trustees and found the one that we liked. The other question to ask yourself is, when will the trust come into existence? Our trust comes into existence after our death, but you may not want that. You may want the trust to come into existence before. If your loved one is harassing you to death about money, which I hear all the time on the helpline, you may want the trust to come into existence before your death and have the trustee that you've chosen from the trust deal with all the nonsense that's coming from your loved one. So, you know, that's a consideration. And we still are thinking about that because our son goes up and down with his symptoms, and, you know, and when they're really severe, they can really drive you crazy, as you probably know, some of you. So we have considered bringing that trust into existence. But officially right now, his special needs trust doesn't exist until we both die. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Questions to ask a private trustee, and maybe not even a private trustee, even a bank trustee, any trustee. There's 17 questions I have written here, and they'll be posted, so you don't have to write them down. But these are important questions to ask a potential trustee before you choose one. And like I said, we interviewed 12 trustees before we chose one. The more trustees you interview, the better off you'll be, until you find someone that you feel comfortable with. Now, again, it's managing from the grave. So, you know, you have to, there's some amount of faith that goes into this thing. Now, I must say that one of the things you can do with a special needs trust, or any trust for that matter, but a special needs trust, is you appoint the trustee, and then you can appoint a successor trustee if you want. Like if the trustee quits, or there's a second level, or gets old and retires. But you can also appoint something called a trust protector, and it can be one person or more than one person. And the role of the trust protector is to keep tabs on the trustee. Maybe once a year, they'd have a report written by the trustee to say what's going on with your loved one. And they have the power, the trust protector has the power to hire and fire a trustee, but they are barred from being the trustee themselves. It's a very handy thing to have because.
So Jack, would that be someone like your daughter? That would be the, or do you?
In fact, it is our daughter.
Okay.
We appointed, and she knows that that's going to be her role. She keeps tabs on the trustee, and if the trustee is not doing a good job, according to her, she can fire the trustee and appoint another trustee. But she can't appoint herself as the trustee. She's barred from doing that. And we felt that was a great idea and a great way to give us more peace of mind that the money is going to be used wisely and not squandered. So that's important. To have a trust protector, and it can be more than one person. It can be 3 people. It could be a committee. You want it to have an odd number of people because you don't want the trust protectors to start arguing among themselves. All right, let's go through some of these questions that I suggest you ask a potential trustee. Number 1, do you have beneficiaries with a mental illness? And if so, how many? Now, we felt this was very important because, you know, if they're going to deal with a mentally ill person, as you all probably know, there are people who understand it and there are people who don't. And the people who don't can be very well-meaning. They can have this person's best interest in mind, but if they don't get it, if they don't understand mental illness, you probably don't want them as a trustee. And you want to know if they have beneficiaries with mental illness, how many do they have? Do they have 1 or do they have 10? You know, so that's an important thing. You want them to be on the same page as you are with your loved one, understanding the territory, which is a big step. It took me personally years to get to that point because when your loved one first becomes ill, it's alien territory. So you know, it takes a while to understand, oh, this person isn't logical. So I can't reason with, well, this is my own case, and my son is, you know, I can't convince them that they have an illness. My son suffers from a lack of insight into his illness. And I'm a very logical person. And for more than a year or 2 or 3, I felt certain that I could convince him that he had an illness. And I was incorrect. And it took me a long time to learn that. And there are many other aspects of mental illness that, you know, you either know about them, you understand them, you get it, or you don't. So that's an important thing to look for in a trustee. And the second one goes along with that. Do you have psychiatric clinical experience yourself? That kind of goes with number 1. It's not a necessity, you know, I mean, not at all a necessity, but do you have relevant experience with people who have mental illness? And third, how old are you? This is important because, you know, I'm pushing 80 now, and when we first hired our trustee, our trustee for our special needs trust, we were in the late 60s, early 70s, and she was pushing 50. And, you know, she was younger, so that's good. And, but we also discovered that she had a successor plan. In other words, she worked in an office with 3 or 4 other people, and they had a plan where she was training other people to take her place because, you know, she was getting older and she would retire. And then what? You know, we were dead. She was retired. What's going to happen? We didn't want to lay that on our daughter. Because, you know, our daughter has dealt enough with this problem. She doesn't need the headache of trying to manage her brother. So you ask the trustee, do you have a successor plan? What's going to happen after you're gone, or you retire, or the job is too hard, you don't want to do it anymore? So that's a question to ask them. The other one, will you work with the beneficiary's current care team? Our son has a psychiatrist. That's the extent of his care team because he had a case manager and he had a therapist and he had a few other, but he stopped taking his meds and he gave it all up except for his psychiatrist. Because I told him if he doesn't see the psychiatrist, he's going to get kicked off SSI. So that convinced him to go see the psychiatrist because he likes money. So he knew that he wanted to keep the SSI payments coming. I mean, I'm being a little harsh here. He does get something out of seeing a psychiatrist once every 2 months for, 15 minutes or something like that. It's kind of absurd. Anyway, so it's a question that you ask. Will you work with the beneficiary's care team? And the potential trustee will want to work with the beneficiary's care team because they'll take a huge load off of the trustee's shoulders. So if they say, no, I don't do that or something like that, that's a red flag. Do you do case management yourself or do you subcontract it out? That's just interesting for you to know. If they subcontract it out, it's a little more dicey. You kind of would like to have the trustee involved with your loved one rather than just pay other people to deal with the problems. And then what are your fees? There's two ways that private trustees charge for their services. One is a percentage of the principal of the trust. And the other is by the hour. Or sometimes both. But you probably want to know that ahead of time. If your loved one is fairly capable and highly functioning and probably won't need much from the trustee, then you probably want to find somebody who charges by the hour. Yet one other thing the trustee does is they file a tax return for your loved one. So that's important to know. And some of them charge a percentage of the principal of the trust. And if you have a very large trust in the millions of dollars, that can add up pretty fast. That's a lot of money. So you might want to go for the hourly rate. And some trustees will be able to change the way they're paid in the middle of the situation. So your trust protector can say, hey, I want to change to hourly rate rather than by a percentage of the trust. Another question, would you like to read the special needs trust before taking us on? And almost all of them will say yes. If they say no, that's a little suspicious. Don't they want to read what they're doing, what their responsibilities are? Because when they dole out money from the special needs trust, the money can't just be in cash for anything. There's a specified list of things written by Social Security that money can go for. And they can't take a trip to Las Vegas to gamble with it. They can't buy luxury items. They can't buy alcohol. There's a whole list of stuff. It's on the Social Security website that they can and can't use their SSI payments for. And that's a responsibility for the representative payee, which is usually set up when your loved one gets SSI. I'm the representative payee for my son. And, it's okay because he doesn't argue with me too much. And I have to keep track, but not every penny. I have to keep track of what he's spending his money on. So one of the responsibilities of the trustee is to do that, to be the representative payee. And the representative payee has to file reports every year to Social Security. And so the trustee would have to do that. That's what I do every year. Every year, and then there's a couple of reports that happen every 2 years. And it's a pain in the neck. You really have to know what you're doing. Then you can ask them, would you want the power to appoint a successor trustee in case you don't want to serve in the future? And they probably want that power. Whether they've done that in the past is a good question to ask. Who they would appoint, would they appoint another private trustee, or would they do something else, or would they rely on the trust protector? Because our trustee knows that our daughter is the trust protector, And hopefully, again, you can't manage from the grave, but hopefully the two of them would communicate and, decide, oh, you don't want to be the trustee anymore. Who are we going to find to replace you? In our case, she has a whole office of people that can replace her, in theory. And again, do you have a problem with the trust protector built into the trust? If somebody says no to that, that's awful suspicious, because the trust protector is there to make sure that they stay on task and stay honest. So if they answer no, I don't want a trust protector, that's very suspicious. Next slide, Miriam. These are the last set of questions. Do you have experience working with beneficiaries who have mental health challenges? Well, it's not totally necessary for the trustee to have this experience. It's just, it gives us more peace of mind to know that it isn't somebody who works in a bank, and it isn't his uncle or his aunt who really, whoops, go back. Who they're very well-meaning. I'm sure many of you have had the situation where you announced at a family gathering or at a party or something like that, that you have an adult child or a spouse or a sibling with a serious mental illness. And they're all of a sudden they become experts. Oh, have you tried this? Have you tried that? I have a nephew with schizophrenia and this helped him. And, a lot of people have a lot of very well-meaning advice. And if they don't have experience themselves with a family member, close family member having mental illness, usually their advice is not helpful. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. Because you'll say to yourself, yeah, I've tried that. I've done that a million times and it doesn't work. Okay, number 11. Minimum principal requirement. I already touched on that earlier. The different private trustees have different minimum principal requirements. Some have none, but you're lucky if you find somebody like that. But usually they have something of a minimum principal requirement. And if you don't have a big enough principal, there's always the Proxy Parent Foundation or somebody else that, you can do a relative if you want, but, I'm just telling you what other people have told me about appointing relatives.
Jack, would you be able to explain what a proxy parent is?
Well, a proxy means somebody who's substituting for somebody else. So if you're a proxy parent, you're substituting for the actual parent. So the Proxy Parent Foundation substitutes or provides people to substitute for you, the parent, especially after you're dead. And so that proxy means, substitute. Sorry. Is that good enough, Miriam? Yeah. Okay. Okay. PFAC, PFAC stands for Professional Fiduciary Association of California. They have a website. It's large. And they have fiduciaries listed. It's not terribly helpful, but it's just a hint of where to get started. Because there's a couple of lines that each person, each fiduciary, and remember, fiduciary is somebody who is legally bound to have your best interest at heart. And fiduciaries, they have little blurbs about themselves and what their specialty is, and some of them will list mental health trustee or special needs trustee as one of their specialties. It's organized by location, and it's a little bit helpful, but not if you're just starting out, when we were just starting out this process, I looked at the list. And, but the best way to find a trustee is word of mouth. Do you have a friend who has found a trustee, and who are they? And do you mind if I call them up and get an interview? NAMI would love to hand out a list of trustees, but we don't have the staff to vet all the trustees, and we don't want the liability. And we have a policy, actually, NAMI National has a policy that we don't do that. We don't recommend professionals to either our members or people who call us up on the phone. And I know that's very frustrating, but I hope you understand why we can't do that. Number 13, you say to the potential trustee, if you don't want to take our case for one reason or another, can you recommend somebody else? And that's a way to find other people to interview until you find a trustee that you like. And that's very useful. You ask your friends, you ask other people, and this is very useful. You can ask other people in NAMI if they have a special needs trust and who they chose as their trustee or trustees. So it's not only one person. So that's a good way to find a trustee too. I hope you can still hear me. I'm getting messages. Okay. Would you be willing with a co-trustee, work with a co-trustee? You don't have to only have one. You can have 2 or 3. You can have as many as you want. But it gets complicated. How do you handle requests by the beneficiary? That can tell you something about the trustee. Like your beneficiary says, well, I need a new bicycle. Or I need, my girlfriend and I want to go away for the weekend and I need money. I don't know, whatever your beneficiary will ask for. It can be pretty outrageous sometimes. So how do you handle these things? What you're really saying is, do you know how to say no? That's what you're really asking for. And then how do you handle housing requests? Of course, the biggest problem that most of us have had or will have is housing. And it's really hard. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we get calls on the helpline of people who are in danger of losing their housing or are living on the street or are in jail and about to be released or are in a hospital and about to be put on the sidewalk, which, by the way, is illegal. And, how are they going to be housed? And they can't live at home. It's impossible. So it's an interesting question because it's interesting to know how would the trustee answer that question. And the value of a good trustee is they have a lot of connections and they can find housing where you can't, or where even the care team can't, or even the hospital can't. Not always, but they have a lot of connections because that's a very common situation for a trustee, is they're faced with a situation where the beneficiary has been 5150 and is getting out in 4 days and they have no place to go. And they're responsible because you're dead. Do you work alone or with a team of people? It's, again, an interesting question for you to find the answer to. If they work with a team, the chances are great that they have established a line of succession so that if they can't do it, or if they get retired, or they get sick, or get too old, that there's somebody to take their place. And then the last one is, would you meet with us every so often to keep up to date on the beneficiary situation? We meet with our trustee once every 2 or 3 years. And my wife, Laura, and I keep a record of what's going on with our son. Mostly symptoms. And we keep that record for two reasons. One, for our trustee, and one, if he's hospitalized again, we show that to the people who are going to deal with him in the hospital. Because now that he's stopped taking his meds, he decided he wasn't going to sign a release of information for him. So that's a big pain in the neck. But we have this report that we keep current that we can give to people in the hospital or wherever he ends up, the police, the jail, outlining his symptoms. Because he can present fairly well if he's under the gun. But his symptoms are rather severe. And, you know, if you keep track of the symptoms and the dates and his former medication or a list of his medications, that can go a long way to getting the hospital or the jail or wherever they are to pay more attention to you and to your loved one. Okay, let's go on to the last slide. These are some resources. The Proxy Parent Foundation, and I urge you, especially if you have a low principal and you want a special needs trust, to look at this website, proxyparentfoundation.org, because they have a lot of information there. You can call them up, and it can be very useful. The other resource is Baron Miller. He was a presenter at NAMI several times, and he's a lawyer, and he wrote a book. Let me show you the book. It's called Laws We Need to Know. Very thin book. You can read it in a day or two. It's very useful. It has a lot of information that I've already told you and a more detailed description of the special needs trust. But sometimes I advise people if they're really lost and it's just all this information is just too overwhelming. I advise people, Baron Miller has an office in San Francisco, and he's a good guy, and he's a family member, like I said before. And it might be worth a couple, I don't know what he charges these days, but it might be worth consulting with him for an hour about what you need and where to go and how to start. So, you know, you can look him up on the internet. He has an office in San Francisco. It's in the middle of downtown. It's a little hard to park, but you can go and talk to him. The other is Stephen Dale. Stephen Dale is also a lawyer. I'm trying to check on the time. That's his website, dalelawfirm.com. And on that website are some really good videos. And there's some other good videos if you just search in YouTube for Stephen Dale is his name, Stephen Dale. And there's one that he has in particular on ABLE accounts. I told you what an ABLE account was. It's a way for your loved one to actually save money or for you to give him more money, him or her, more than the $2,000 limit. But one of the rules about being eligible for that, the eligibility criteria, is that they have to have been ill before they were 26. And you have to, quote, prove that. However, that's pretty loose. Like with our son, he didn't really start showing symptoms until he was after 26. But we found an old receipt that he had gone to a psychologist at age 25. And we used that. And then later on, we talked to his psychiatrist at Behavioral Health and Recovery Services. And the psychiatrist said, don't worry about it. If they ever come and ask, I'll write a letter saying he must have been ill before he was 26. So it's kind of loose. Don't let that stop you from establishing an ABLE account. But remember, the money in the ABLE account belongs to the beneficiary, not to the people who put money in, unless it was him. But if he gets a job, if your loved one gets a job and is going to go over the $2,000 limit, that's a way to have him or her save money. So check out Stephen Dale on YouTube. He's a very knowledgeable lawyer. I already mentioned the Professional Fiduciary Association of California. There's their website. Oh, that dash should be a dot. Well, no, effect-pro.org. And then if you want to learn more about CalAble and you can't get it from Stephen Dale's video, go to calable.ca.gov. And they have a whole explanation there of what an ABLE account is. And ABLE accounts are managed by the IRS, so they don't get mixed up with Social Security. And the IRS isn't as stringent about checking on things as Social Security. All right. We have a little bit of time for questions. Miriam, yeah, stop the sharing screen.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jack. We do have a couple questions in the chat, so I will be reading them out to you. Some of them are logistical questions, so I'll go ahead and answer them. Yes, this presentation will be available, including the slide deck as well as the video, once we're able to edit and have it uploaded onto our website, as well as our YouTube channel. The first question that you have, Jack, in the chat is from Linda, which is, have you asked the fiduciaries about their investment experience, guiding principles, or who manages investment of the money for them?
Yes, I didn't include that. I sort of took it for granted, but you're right. The money gets invested, especially if it's a large amount of money. And one of the things we have an investment advisor for our trust, and we asked our potential trustee, would you work with the investment advisor and invest in the money? And if not, do you have your own resources about investments, and what philosophy do you have around investments? Because you obviously don't want the money invested in risky things. Is that
Great, thank you. I believe so. Jan, you have a question. I see your hand raised. Would you like to ask it to Jack?
Yes, hi. Let me get rid of my hand.
Oh, you're muted, or I can't hear you.
Oh,
there you are.
Oh, hi, Jack. Yeah, so this is, you can't hear me?
Can anybody else hear her?
I can hear Jack.
Oops, I can't hear anybody.
Let me see. Let me
read it, Miriam. Oh no, she's talking.
Yeah,
I'm not now. I'm talking now. Can you hear me
now?
now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, good. Just my question is that this has been mostly about the Special Needs Trust. As of right now, our son is not on any government assistance. He seems to be going in a downward spiral, so I would think maybe he'd end up on that. But for now, I guess if we were setting something up, it would have to be the Spendthrift Trust.
Spendthrift Trust, yeah.
How is that different, or would you go through the same thing of getting a fiduciary to handle?
It depends who you want to dole out the money to. Who you want to have the responsibility for doling out money to him.
Yeah, I have no idea. Well, certainly not a family member.
Right, it's probably a bad idea, right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't have personal experience with Spendthrift Trusts, so I would point you to Baron Miller to do that. Read his book. He has a bit in there about Spendthrift Trusts, and you're kind of on your own. You have to do some research on your own about, but I would guess that you still need a lawyer to help you with it.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of danger. You're managing from the grave, so you want to have the trust written, in such a way that it's not going to be questioned, or you'll have a problem with it after you do it.
Yeah. And then generally, like the fiduciary and the what's the person who oversees the fiduciary?
The trust protector.
Trust protector, yeah. So the trust protector, I assume, gets paid also? Well, yeah.
You can write that in, but since it's our daughter,
yeah,
she doesn't get paid. So she's going to get half our estate, so that's enough.
Yeah. But we might have
But if
to,
it's somebody else, if it's not a family member, it's not somebody like that, I'm sure you can write that into the trust.
yeah.
That
Yeah.
the trust protector does get paid.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your question,
Michelle,
Dan.
put your hand up.
Oh, we do have something in the chat, and so I'll ask the chat. Sorry, Michelle, and then we'll go back to you. So we'll bounce back and forth that way. Everyone's covered. So Gita asked, how often do you meet with the trustee or the
That depends. Late, when our son was taking his meds and being cooperative and somewhat rational, we met with her once every 3 years. But since he stopped taking his meds and he has more difficult symptoms, let's put it that way, we've been meeting with her every year.
every week?
I want to keep her up to date on what's going on.
Okay. Did you say every year or every week? Sorry, I didn't catch
No,
that.
no, every year.
Every year. Okay.
And
Great.
I mean, if he ends up hospitalized again or something like that, or in jail, or even 5150 again, we'd probably meet with her sooner rather than later, just to keep her up to date.
Thank you,
By
Jack.
the way, there's one more thing I want to say. If you have additional questions for me, or you want to know more, or you want to talk to me, call the NAMI helpline and leave me a message. My name is Jack. Just say, and the NAMI helpline number is on the NAMIMarin.org website. Okay?
Great. Thank you, Jack. Michelle, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. My question was just, you had mentioned that you already have a trust. So I already have a living trust. And right now my daughter would get, as the beneficiary, she would get half of the money at 25 and half the money at 30. But this was all created, before she had mental illness. And I need to figure out. So does the special needs trust just come into play after is it already set up, or how does your family trust then pour into it after, like your daughter gets this half of the trust and that sets up the special need, like the funding?
The special needs trust is written out, and the document, which is really the special needs trust, is embedded in our family trust. But there's a provision in there which says this trust does not exist until both of the people, my wife and I die.
Okay.
And
so
what's going to happen?
Yeah,
what's
makes
going to
sense.
happen is when we pass away, then our lawyer will be contacted, and she's aware of our family trust and the special needs trust, and she will do whatever she has to do to bring it into existence and set it up.
Okay. So it's built into the family trust as an addendum or whatever, but then it separates once you guys pass. Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Good question.
Okay, great. We do have a question from Capella, which is, can you give a list of symptoms or examples? We may have different representations of mental illness available, those with psychotic disorders, those with not. Again, Jack's not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so he can't give you all the symptoms, but I guess symptoms that the trustee would need to know or the fiduciary would need to know when working with.
Well, I mean, our son has, I don't know if you're familiar with the term negative symptoms and positive symptoms of schizophrenia. He has what I diagnosed myself after seeing a million psychiatrists is schizoaffective disorder. And schizoaffective disorder is schizophrenia combined with one or more mood disorders. And if you look up schizophrenia in the what is it called?
The diagnostics manual.
Yeah, there's a shortcut for it.
PDA.
Anyway, what is it? DSM, right.
DSM.
There's a list. If you look at schizophrenia, there's a list for negative symptoms and positive symptoms. And if it's primitive how they diagnose schizophrenia. And you check off the symptoms that you're aware of that your loved one has. And if you have, I don't know, 5 out of 9 or whatever it is, then they say, oh, your loved one has schizophrenia. it's not very scientific. Anyway, if you look at those symptoms, our son has a lot of negative symptoms, which is a complete lack of social skills and affect. So you talk to him and it's like you're talking to a brick wall. You don't get anything back. So every once in a while he'll smile, but not often. And the other one is he's very, very isolated. He doesn't like to be around other human beings. These are all negative symptoms. The positive symptoms are more psychotic, like paranoia, delusions. He doesn't hear voices. The paranoia is really can be very extreme. Like he won't talk on the phone in his apartment because he's afraid other people will hear, and there are people walking on the street under his apartment and he's afraid of them. So that's a manifestation of paranoia combined with delusions. And that's kind of scary. That's the scariest. I don't know, they're typical. Oh, and depression with a capital D. That's his mood disorder. A big capital D depression, which is also scary because it hasn't, but it can drift into suicidal ideation. But it can be more subtle than that. I mean, if you have somebody who isn't that sick, schizophrenia is serious, but is a serious illness. But if you have somebody who's just uncooperative, I mean, you know the story. It's really hard sometimes to differentiate between an unruly teenager and somebody who is drifting into mental illness. And, it's a really hard job, and it's a hard job for psychiatrists too. But, you just have to use describe your loved one. Well, how are they? How do they behave? Do they blame you for absolutely everything? That's another symptom that my son had. My life doesn't work because of you. I have no money because of you. I can't find a job because of you. I mean, I think a lot of us have experienced that. And it's very hard to take when you're not prepared for it at first. But that's, and I'm sure if you get even a good trustee, they'll do that to the trustee too. They'll say, you're ruining my life, and the trustee has to be prepared to deal with that.
Thank you, Jack. We have a lot more great questions, but I also want to be conscientious of your time. Would you want to stay longer, or would you want me to write down the questions and email it to you and then email it to the group? Because
well, I can do sort of both. I'm retired, so I have time. And but if we run out of time, even with some additional questions, that'd be a good idea to email.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll continue going then.
Yeah.
But if anyone has to leave, you are more than you're more than welcome to, but we'll continue asking questions, which may be helpful for you if you also stayed. So next question from Julene is, how did you get your son to go through SSI process if he doesn't identify as ill? I would like to add on to that question is that especially if the child or the adult child is at this age where they could still work, and maybe there are periods in their life where they can work, and then periods in their life where they do get sick. How does the SSI process work with sort of the fluctuations that?
Exactly.
Well, in our case, I hesitate to say this, but we were kind of lucky. SSI is hard to get on. You're usually rejected right away, and then you have to appeal, and they drive you crazy. But in our case, our son was 5150 by force by the police when he was 28 or something like that. Yeah. He was really delusional. We called the mobile crisis team. They came out with police backup, and the police were out of sight. And the the mobile crisis team lady said she started talking to our son, and she said, "Well, how do you make a living? What do you have a job?" And he said, "Oh, I go around with my begging bowl to different monasteries and get money." This is a total delusional answer. And the police took him to the hospital. We're in general at that time, it's called. And he was 5150. And I had one of those reports of his behavior. And I also, this is important, I also had some experience with NAMI. And the hospital nurses there knew that. They knew that I was a volunteer at NAMI. And I don't know if it made any difference at all, but my guess is it did. And so they 5150 him. Then he ended up being in the hospital in a locked ward, different hospitals, different facilities for 3.5 months, which is really unusual. That's why I say we were lucky. And he was seen in the hospital by several different psychiatrists, and he had about 5 different diagnoses, because it's all guesswork, really. The psychiatrists just guess. The educated guess, but a guess nonetheless. And when he got out, he had one of his diagnoses was schizophrenia, which is a great diagnosis to have if you're trying to get SSI. And he had a caseworker assigned to him after he got out of the hospital. I went with him to what's now BHRS, Marin Mental Health, and he was assigned a caseworker. And the caseworker set up an appointment with him at Social Security office. And I went with him to the Social Security office. And the Social Security lady, I was expecting the worst. And she looked down at his paperwork and saw that he had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And after 5 minutes, we were out of there. And he was on SSI. So like I said, we were lucky, which I say with the sort of tongue in cheek, because 3.5 months in the hospital is not lucky, but yes, it is lucky if you're trying to navigate our so-called mental health system. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. And it also brings more questions that I think would lead to more advocacy to simplifying these systems for parents, because again, this is a fluctuating situation. There could be periods of great years and periods of not so great years. And so I'm sorry that it's not a straightforward answer for everyone, but I think maybe even, and Jack, this is also your advice on the helpline, is to document everything. Document symptoms, document what they're doing, so that if you do need to appeal, even if it's in a period in which your adult child or sibling or someone that you're caretaking for is doing well, you could still have this documentation of patterns that there may be an eventuality when they're not doing so well. Of course,
Right.
God forbid, we would not want that, but at least it's sort of a reassurance of patterns that you could use so that they can get to best support.
One of the things that I'll add is, if you're on SSI, you can work, and part-time usually. And for every $2 you earn, for every $2 of earned income, you lose $1 of your benefits. So they're trying to incentivize people to actually work. That's
Great, thank you.
interesting.
There's a question from Marilyn. I'm gonna say, as NAMI, I don't think we can actually share this information out on this call, but if you would like to talk to Jack privately about who his fiduciary is, I'm gonna leave it up to Jack to answer
No,
that.
I can't divulge that.
Okay, so unfortunately we can't answer that question, but let's say you have questions about how to find a fiduciary or a trustee. You can call the helpline, or you can use the resources that Jack has mentioned, and perhaps they can point you in direction to get those questions answered. So Marian, I don't know if I understand your question, so if you would like to ask it on through the mic, if you're still on. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Well, my question is, like, my son has a rep payee, so he is on government benefits, and then so they pay. He's in the Buckley program, so they pay his room and board, and then there's a little bit left over, so he gets like a small stipend that's sent to him. So if he has a rep payee, does that somehow affect if we're going to try to make a special needs trust for him in terms of, I guess when he needs some money or something, like, I'm not sure how would that work? I understand that he can only have like $2,000, and right now his needs are very minimal, because I've been using a special credit card for things expenses that he incurs. But if he has a rep payee, then does that complicate a financial picture for him?
Well, not really, but if he has a trustee and a different person as the rep payee, they have to communicate with it. Well, so who's going to do the taxes, for example? They have to kind of cooperate with each other, because the trustee is handing out money and the rep payee is also dealing with money. So they have to cooperate with one another.
But because there's this dollar limit, right? Because if he's getting government benefits and he can only have like $2,000 any given day. So that means
at the end of the month, you can have more at the beginning of the month, but at the end of the month, this was painful to find out, that at the end of the month, they look at the money. And if he has $5,000 or no, $3,000 at the beginning of the month, that's fine. But he can only have $2,000 at the end of the month.
Okay. But so that means that if there's a mechanism for him to have more money, that means that the trustee or the fiduciary needs to be cognizant of this monetary issue with having benefits and having a rep payee, that there has to be this understanding. And then the other question that I have is like, well, if you've left your assets, you're gone, and you're gone. And then now there's a special needs trust. But what happens if there's some very serious illness? Like, say your loved one gets a serious illness like cancer. So does that mean that, you've hired this fiduciary to oversee all the entire care for this loved one?
Yes, everything.
Everything. And so that means that if you're interviewing somebody, not only are you asking them if they've had any experience with someone with mental challenges, but also like, okay, if there's some medical emergency, are they equipped to be making those kinds of decisions on behalf of your loved one?
Yeah, that's a good question. But they are in charge of everything. They're in charge of all the money.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like you're trusting them to make good decisions for your loved ones.
Yeah, that's why we interviewed 12 different people. It's a very, very important role in this whole situation.
Yeah.
And like I said, we also trust our daughter, who's the trust protector. Hopefully in a situation like that, of a serious illness, she would be on top of it. She would know that her brother was sick, and she would talk to the trustee about how the money was going to be handled. And, so that's another level of protection.
Mm-hmm. And then in the eventuality that your loved one passes away, and then there's some balance left in the special needs fund. So then you have something that says, okay, if there's some assets left, the person is deceased, then that asset goes to you designated.
Yeah, our daughter. It goes
Okay.
to our daughter.
Yeah.
But it can go wherever you want. But
right. I mean, I just realizing that that's also part of the whole list of things, bases that you need to have covered when you're.
Now, that's why for us it was important to have a lawyer write the trust. But she was really good knowing.
So you had a separate lawyer to do a family trust, and then a separate lawyer to create the special needs trust.
Yes.
And then you have this fiduciary trustee.
Yes.
And so they all like know of each other and can communicate with each other about whatever is going on.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, well,
That's
you
exactly right.
done.
But the trustee lawyer, our trustee, not the special needs trust, our trustee lawyer is the go-to person when we're there.
You say that
He
again.
knows to contact. Everybody knows to contact her when we die.
Okay. Okay.
She's the one who recommended the lawyer that wrote the special needs trust. They know each other.
Okay. Well, you've really done a lot. I really appreciate all this information. Thank you so much, Jack.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jack. How's your energy levels, Jack? We do have more questions, but again, I could also email this to you, email the questions to you.
I'm fine. Go ahead. And look, I had COVID for the entire month of August.
Okay.
And I was in a cave. And now I'm finally better. So I'm out and about.
Great, good. So Jack's ready to socialize and answer your questions. Okay. So we have a question from Marcia Naomi Berger, who, for everyone here, will be our storytelling presenter next week on Monday. So if you haven't already signed up for that, please go on our website, go to our calendar, and sign up for that storytelling event. And Marcia's question is, does the Spendthrift Trust apply to someone with no mental illness diagnosis, but he spends impulsively and could blow a big inheritance quickly? This is someone
I didn't get the beginning of that. The talking about a special needs trust or some other.
Or the Spendthrift.
The Spendthrift Trust.
Yeah, so they're describing someone, maybe they have symptoms of a mental illness, but they're not diagnosed. Like they spend impulsively, could have a big inheritance, addicted to smoking and drinking, and is not
Yeah,
but
the Spendthrift Trust doesn't have really anything to do with mental illness. It's simply a way to filter the money or any assets through somebody else legally. It's all legal. So when you talk about your son or where,
yeah, my son,
loved one, yeah, he can't get the money. He can't. The money is not. He knows how much. He might know how much is there, but he can't get his hands on it. It has to come through the trustee.
Thank you. That's very good information. Yeah, we already have the family trust, but I think the way it was left is some bank is supposed to be the trustee, and so we have some work to do.
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And Gita has another question, which is, can the office of the county guardian act as a trustee? So how does conservatorship play into trust? And do you know? It's all right if you don't, but this was the question.
You know, I'm not sure about the answer to that question. I do know somebody I can ask to find out, but a conservator, there's two kinds of conservators. There's a conservator of the person and there's a conservator of the estate. And the conservator, and sometimes they're the same person, but the conservator of the person takes care of them if they're sick and their daily needs. The conservator of the estate handles money. I know that. And if they're conserved with not an LPS conservatorship, but I forget what the name of the other one is, the conservator of the state, which is money, there's no doubt that that conservator would be doling out the money. So you don't even need a trust in that case. If they're conserved, if their estate is conserved, you don't need a trust because the conservator will handle it if you trust the conservator. You know? The conservators are somebody who works in an office by the Civic Center, and you know, they can quit or get old or retire or something like that. You don't have any, you know, you have to trust the public guardian's office to appoint another conservator that's decent. So, you know, you're giving up some control when you don't have your own trust.
That's a really good point. And we are on our very last question. We made it down the list. Great questions. Which is, and maybe this is more of an explanation of what's the difference between SSDI versus SSI, and why would someone want their child to be on SSI versus SSDI?
Oh, that's the last question.
That's the last question.
I've spent hours trying to write a paper about the difference between those two benefits. And first of all, they're very different. Some people say, well, my son is on disability. The D in SSDI stands for disability. So they'll say, well, my son is on disability. And I'll always follow that up with, are they on SSI or are they on SSDI? Because there's a huge difference between the two. SSI is run by the US government and is designed for poor people. And a lot of those poor people are disabled. That's why, you know, it's not in the name of the thing, but it's usually ends up for disabled people. The biggest difference is that there's an asset limit for SSI. $2,000 at the end of the month, or else you lose it. And if you try to fool them and violate it, they'll try to get their money back, and they'll go after you like a hound dog. SSDI is run by the state, and it's an insurance program for people who have earned money working. You can get SSI if you never had a job, or if you just had a few part-time jobs. But SSDI, you have to pay into. You have to have a job that earns you money legally. And if you look on the pay stub, it'll say SSDI. And there's a certain percentage of your pay that goes into this insurance fund. And if you get disabled, the D stands for disability, then you can file for SSDI benefits, which is, well, I paid into this fund, I'm now disabled, I want my benefits. And they usually reject you right away because they're afraid of fraud. And it takes months, sometimes over a year, if you're really disabled, to get qualified, to get it, to get on their rolls. Like I said, there's no asset limit. And as far as having a trustee for it, you know, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know whether you can set up a trustee for SSDI payments. I kind of doubt it, but maybe you can. I don't know. I really don't know. My son was never on SSDI. He never worked enough. And so I don't know the ins and outs of it.
Thank you, Jack. So just to clarify, it's because your son hasn't had an employment history, or at least one that would qualify for SSDI, which is why he applied, or why you applied for him for SSI.
Yeah, SSDI is much better. If you have a choice between the two, you want to get on SSDI because it has no asset limit and no, you know, there's a lot less paperwork involved and proving this and proving that. SSI is a bureaucratic nightmare sometimes, especially when you have to do your reports and if you have to communicate with them as a rep payee, as a representative payee, let's just all leave it there. It was a nightmare. But I now have it figured out.
Thank you, Jack. And okay, so we have reached the end of our questions in the chat, which is almost perfect. We're almost at the half hour of 7 o'clock. So it was a full a full general meeting that we would have had with a speaker from elsewhere as well. And I also just wanted to sing Jack's praises a little bit. Jack often talks about that his son thinks that he's out to get him, or there's like a lack of appreciation there. But you could see and you could just hear it in Jack's voice that this is all coming from a place of fierce love and fierce steadfastness in sort of the difficulties that not only he's experiencing with his family, but also a deep appreciation and love for other families that are facing this as well. Like this is, and I think this is sometimes gets lost in mental health conversations, but an extreme love for his son too. And so I just wanted to honor your journey, Jack, and sort of the knowledge that you've acquired over a decade and more. I mean, it's not easy and it's definitely been difficult and challenging. And the words that I'm saying is not enough to convey that. And the families here know that as well. But I did want to really take a moment to honor you because what you've shared here will help and impact not just the parents here, but also everyone. So thank you, Jack.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone would want to come on camera or say something to Jack too. But yes, just wanted to say thank you, Jack.
One of the reasons I volunteered at NAMI, and I have for so long, was that if I can spare anybody the depth of pain that's involved when you have a seriously mentally ill adult child, there's just no question. That's just true. And you all know, most of you know that. I also facilitate family support groups, so that's how I was introduced. Well, I was introduced to NAMI with a family-to-family class, and then I went to a family support group and then became a family support group facilitator. And if you need support, if you need help, if you need more information, go to a NAMI family support group. They're really good.